Hello and welcome to Exchanges for a brand new season. We are coming to you in a different way in 2026. Look out for some new episodes, some new individual ideas, but as always, an exchange with an expert in their field. And today is a great first episode to start 2026, considering just how hot property is being discussed. Eliza Owen needs no introduction, the former head of research at Cotality, but her voice in property has rung out around Australia for the last decade and a half, and she is the best person to get onto and to talk about exactly where property is going, not just in 2026 and into the future, but the levers that need to be pulled to alleviate the areas that are impacting you more than ever. Before we go on, don't forget, this episode is brought to you by More. More is a fantastic app platform designed to help you get ahead with your overall property and investment portfolio. It is about making sure that you can have complete clarity in your understanding about going forward. That is why More and the More app is one thing you should check out today. But before we go any further, here is Eliza Owen to discuss the property market in 2026 and beyond. Eliza Owen, welcome to Exchanges Season 4. Australian property market is pretty incredible right now. There is, I think, the most amount of input into the property market I've seen probably since 2019 with regards to policy, the most amount of risk that's inside the property market that I've seen for probably about 10 to 15 years. Let's therefore dive into I think the biggest one that we're leading into with the May budget is, can you see changes happening to property tax and other legislation that is going to start 2026 with more than a bang we've already had, which will be interest rates, which we'll get to in a moment?
I think that it is time for our politicians to be more bold around housing reform. I think politically, they're in a good place with a weakened opposition. And I think publicly, we're seeing a lot more rental stress and housing values up 66% since the last time negative gearing and capital gains tax reform was tabled at the 2019 election. So we're there. I think, the political pressure is built, the cost of living pressure is built to a point where we have a government that is not refusing or not ruling out changes to capital gains and negative gearing, if we
So,
can call that bold.
yeah. So, I mean, again, are they going to be bold? I'll put that question to one side. The caveat I'll give to you, I'll get to sit here and play devil's advocate for you straight away, which is already as expected. There is pushback to these changes, as you would expect. What would a capital gains tax reduction from the current 50% after 1 year of ownership down to, for argument's sake, which is what has been sort of leaked to the media, the 33% figure that's been suggested. What would that actually do? Like, at the moment, the pushback is that it will stop investment, blah, blah, blah. Put that to one side. That's overemphasis. But is there actually going to be a meaningful movement in the amount of property that could be released from this, but also the kinds of revenue, intake that comes from realistically cutting this down by a third?
Yeah. So there's massive savings for the government in not providing the same level of concession for the resale of property. Um, there's still detail to be understood as to how it would actually affect, say, the release of property. For example, whether the policy would be grandfathered or not.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's hard with a flat. To me personally, I feel like going from one set discount to another could be missing out on an opportunity to have maybe going back to indexation, which would be more fair. And the technology has evolved in terms of property evaluation and documentation of inflation that I would have thought going into a indexation model would be better.
So the argument that comes at you on that answer, because I'm going to put my hand up. I actually agree with what you're saying. So I'm going to
Yeah.
put my hand up and say that there is absolutely a need, a want to change this towards inflation. So if you take the current average inflation, it's going to take about 16 years to get to half
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
discount in
Yeah.
terms of where it is, rather than getting it after 1 year. The caveat that comes with one of your answers, and this is where again the pushback's coming, is grandfathering, which again the whole reason I feel, and I know you're all over this as well, that this has come about is this genuine those that have and those that don't. And
Yeah.
again, the younger generations that are clearly going to be paying more tax than any other generation that has ever lived. And they're again going to get slugged with it is anyway, because they're going to be the ones under the new system. The old system carries through. Do you think there is enough political, sort of now slash might to actually go, no, we're not going to grandfather at all. We're going to give you 2 years, maybe 3 years to try and walk away from the 50%. Because again, the caveat is that those that are in now get the treatment they've already had, and they will argue that's fair and probably could be.
Mhm.
But again, it means that those that are getting in today will end up still being behind because they're not going to benefit from the
Exactly.
50%.
Yeah, you're quite right. So the best way to further the equality of wealth distribution is not to grandfather the policy.
Mhm.
However, whether there is the political will to do that, I don't know. We will find out in a couple of months. I kind of hope it is not grandfathered, but at the same time, I feel like then just going to uh reduced concession of 33% is just not going to be fair for all buyers, depending on the market that they bought into, expecting a 50% discount on capital gain. What I do think this will address from a pragmatic perspective, because I have heard a lot of pushback around, oh, well, investors just won't sell if they don't get the same juicy capital gains discount that they could before. And part of me is like, "You're good?" That kinda sounds like you're providing long-term rental accommodation then.
Yeah.
So what I saw in my role at Cotality, I would do this resales analysis every year, and people were making hundreds of thousands of dollars after holding a property for just 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And it's almost like the system that we have in place now encourages short-term speculation by giving a 50% discount on capital gains after 1 year. So
Yep.
if nothing else, that needs to change, because I think you will avoid shorter-term speculation in what really should be a long-term asset, provide greater rental security, and hopefully provide just better housing outcomes as well. A big lesson for me was in the 2010s, where you had the largely speculative, investor driven, off the plan apartment boom, where people were buying into these apartments and selling them shortly after they were completed because they only needed to own them for a short period of time to get massive capital gains tax. To get massive capital gain windfall and then get the big tax benefit. And it also meant that a lot of the apartment product being delivered was very investor grade, and it didn't reflect something that Australians would want to live in long term.
This is the thing, like, this is my world, which you're going into, which is the behavior, right? So I love that this is the speculation around it, and it's clear. So the rise and rise, I'm going to get your view on it, of things like, rent vesting. The rent vesting is now becoming this idea of this, you know, panacea of wealth creation. There is a lot of noise. There's a lot of miscommunication and disinformation about rent vesting. Is that being built from those 10 eras where we saw, the apartment run, then we got into the town housing scenario that we now have ourselves in, and the lower end new construction? All of this comes down to the lever that is fiscal policy that you're talking about here. Where do you first and foremost see rent vesting? But also, does this also suggest that if we are removing those speculation tools, the product itself will improve?
I think there might be a short-term feasibility challenge with some of the product.
Hmm.
I think a lot of developers at the moment are crying out for more investor interest in the market to further push up prices and improve feasibility. But the fact is, we can't keep going down that road just to satisfy the short-term business needs of developers. We actually need to think about a good, fair housing landscape. And part of that means that builders and developers are going to have to find their feasibility from cost cutting, increased productivity. That does come back to aspects of fiscal policy, like around labor, for example, around zoning is a big one. So Sydney and Melbourne, for their size, are some of the least dense cities in the world. And the Grattan Institute has put out, recently this More Homes, Better Cities report, where they see a big uplift in project feasibility by upzoning and being more flexible on floor space ratios with a lot of new development as well. Um, but yeah, I don't think just pumping more investors into the market is the answer. Um,
So
I
is
th-
it government? Is it partly, looking at, council housing, public housing, etc. I mean, we keep hearing this, but also the other thing, looking at the counter argument that happened to the Grattan Institute sort of report was E61, which points out that the drive into high density living is not actually what the market is talking about. It's around, townhousing 3 to 4, townhouses on a standardized block in Melbourne or Sydney. Where
Mm,
where where is
mm.
the inverted commas the investor? Is it supposed to be public housing, or do we have to continue to, as you have alluded to there, look at what the private investor needs to stomach inverted commas over the medium to longer term rather than a short term?
I mean, absolutely. I really don't understand why government shifted away from the direct delivery of public housing into community and complex models. Um, but the benefit of having more public housing is that you're not only creating a greater safety net for your most critical part of what we call the housing crisis, which, has become this really catch-all term that goes from anything to facing homelessness to maybe paying an extra $50 a week on a high-end rental. Like,
Mhm.
um, the public increase in public housing stock specifically is necessary to broaden the housing safety net, but it also takes more pressure off the private rental market, where the private rental market has been increasingly occupied by higher income, older households because of the gradual decline in home ownership over time. So I think, it's a multi-pronged strategy of increasing investment in public housing, which historically went from around 10% of new dwelling approvals in the 1980s to average about 2% today. It's having greater protection in the private rental market where more and more households are spending more of their life, and also finding ways to bring down the price of housing so that it becomes more affordable for owner occupation, um, rather than continuing down this path of easier access to finance and
So
grants.
on that, because I mean, that is, clearly part of the answer, which is to try and actually get into and driving down house prices. The catch is that all policy over the last 30, 40 years has been about increasing the price of property. If you look at you know, even politicians are actually biased towards the idea of higher house prices. How do you get around that? And then we'll start
Mm,
bringing into the next part of the conversation also is when negative gearing sets in this as well, which is
mm.
clearly, if you've got an incentive to invest in something that can reduce your taxable income and reduce your overall taxation, it creates a behavior for, again, those further up the wealth chain to do this.
Yeah.
How do you break that? Because again, if you're starting to impact people's wealth effect and you're going to start bringing down their overall wealth, you are also going to start moving into other parts of the economy like consumption. How do we move through that? I mean, I know that's a really massive question. That's what we do here. Um, but that is the next conundrum that we're facing with that, yes?
So part of me wonders if it just doesn't start with a better conversation about the equity that Australians have in their homes. The federal election, um, in the lead up, you had both Labor and the opposition saying that they wanted to see housing values continue to rise, albeit
Mhm.
lower than income growth. And when asked why, they were concerned about negative equity, this idea that if house prices fell, then you'd be putting households in this vulnerable position where the outstanding debt on their home was more than the value of the property, and it was this great systematic risk and whatever.
Mortgage jail, yeah? Or mortgage prison.
Yeah, and I'm sitting here looking at resale data where even if you reduced everyone's sale price by 10%, the median gain from resale was still going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Or analysis from the RBA that showed a 30% drop in housing values overnight would still see close to 90% of households in positive equity. And I'm like, why aren't those statistics part of the conversation that we're having? I think you've got older Australians who have wealth in the family home who are having to give money to their kids anyway to get into the housing market and sometimes tapping into their home equity to do it. I think you'd have a lot of um, I think you'd have a lot of even outright homeowners who would welcome a bit of a decline in property prices if it meant that their kids and their grandkids could have easier access to the housing market. um, some of the work that Amplify are doing. So Amplify is this organization that does like engagement with the community around big political issues, and they've been very focused on housing. And they actually found, like in talking to people, and when you took the time to educate people about the specifics of the housing market and housing policy, that there was pretty broad-based agreement on things like increasing density. Even before going into their workshops, I think there was pretty broad support of things like negative gearing and capital gains tax reform. And I guess the other aspect is that a relatively small portion of Australia's working population are property investors. So even though they might be very vocal, I don't know that they have as much political sway if they're not a majority of the population.
So let's then move to negative gearing. The idea that's been sort of leaked out again is, limiting negative gearing to 2 properties.
Mhm.
I mean, that then basically limits it to, I think it's around about 800,000 people that have more than that across the country, which is a reasonable amount. Let's not sort of beat around the bush on that. But does that actually fix the problem? Again, because negative gearing has been seen as an investment principle, and as I said before, it's about helping reduce taxable wealth issues. Will this actually move the dial?
I think it will definitely help. I think you only have to look at things like in Victoria, for example, where they've implemented a lower threshold for paying land tax, vacancy tax, basically increased taxes for investors. And it's led to a situation where even though the estimates of additional tax that would be paid on a property of 650,000, I think it was like an extra $2,000 a year that would have to be paid on tax as a result, it was enough to see investors exit the market. There are other factors that have triggered that across Victoria: sluggish capital return, weak population growth, weak economic performance. But combined with this additional tax, even from the announcement of the tax, you started to see a reduction in total rental stock. That meant that investors were offloading properties because they didn't want to pay the additional tax. Now, you would have thought there's a concern around precious rental stock, which is
Mhm.
so vital in a tight rental environment. But in actual fact, growth in rents across Melbourne haven't been as strong as in other capital cities. And talking to real estate agents down in Victoria, they said, yeah, we are selling investment properties to first home buyers. It's a tougher slog for them because the investor has an expectation on their price point. The first home buyer maybe doesn't have the budget that they're looking for, but the sales are happening, the market is shifting, and the composition of investors to owner occupiers is changing. Now, as to the specific impact that limiting negative gearing could have, I don't know exactly. And again, it's going to depend on the details of the policy, but it seems like a pretty obvious step in the right direction for having a more fair tax system, because obviously most of these gains go to relatively wealthy households as well,
Mhm.
and treating housing as something that is more something to live in and not a speculative asset to make profit on.
Yeah, so my way I argue that is that when did a home become a house? To sort of answer, and that's what I just want
Mhm.
to go back though on a few things you just mentioned there, which I think is also part of this next conversation is state taxation, right? So I live in Victoria. I know exactly what you're talking about. It was rallied against, but it's clearly had an actual positive impact, as you said, in terms of that transfer. Then you have to bring in the other part that everybody also talks about, which is stamp duty and the impact that stamp duty brings to what is a transactional tax, the impactor of, it is the number one reason, if you listen to most elderly people, for not actually acting on moving. Where do we need to look at stamp duty? I mean, does stamp duty now become, because it's such a big part of funding state budgets that it's almost, a chicken and egg scenario. But where do we sit on stamp duty with regards to how housing will move if you were to go down a line like what we've seen in Victoria? It's an additional tax, let's be honest, but
Hmm.
it's stamp duty is the next part of the question, is it not?
Totally. So, stamp duty is generally considered among researchers to be a very inefficient tax in the way
Mhm.
that it affects mobility and um, the turnover of housing. It's a big impediment to moving. It's a big distortion in your approach to the housing market. So nowadays, with a combination of high stamp duty and properties themselves just being so expensive, and the average first home buyer being, at the last measurement back in 2019, 2020, the average home buyer age was 34 years old. So the first home buyer is a family home buyer. And only, if you want to reduce the amount of times that you pay stamp duty, then you just try and get into the family home first. So it creates all these kinds of distortions around how efficiently we use our existing housing stock. And there are layers and layers of other policy that contribute to that as well. But I think stamp duty would be an ideal one to reform. It is politically so difficult to do. So in New South Wales, former Premier Dominic Perrottet tried to lead a shift from stamp duty to land tax, and it got so watered down from swapping out this one tax to the other that it ended up just being like an option for first home buyers. They could opt to either pay stamp duty or an ongoing land tax. And then it was pretty quickly reversed
Oh,
by
yeah.
the Labor government that got in afterwards. So politically very difficult to do, but, I think it would, again, be a step in the right direction to get rid of something like stamp duty and have an ongoing land tax that is tied to the value of the land. I sort of floated this in a blog around the productivity roundtable last year, and I got a lot of negative feedback from
Yeah.
older Australians who, didn't want to have to pay tax on their land. They had this view that, I've worked hard to pay for my home and pay off my home. I deserve to have this big block of land and all the
Trimmings
bedrooms
that
and
come
all
with
the.
it, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, that was just my small slice of exposure to the kind of backlash that subbing out stamp duty for land tax can have. So I can't imagine how tough it is for politicians to try and push an agenda like that.
Yeah, and that's the research that's shown that. I mean, again, the argument also is, grandfathering, non-grandfathering in terms of where it is. Those of you that paid stamp duty up front, why should I then keep getting slugged after the fact? I've already paid my upfront ridiculous amount. Then there's also the flip side of it that people will point out is the funding side of it, which is that it will actually possibly, if you take the 5.5, 6.5, depending on which state you're listening to this in, out, well, clearly you don't have to have that in deposit. You can therefore, technically ramp up the mortgage that you have and therefore the financing system. So that's why I know the pushback is there,
Mhm.
but clearly it's always raised as a discussion.
Yeah.
We now, as you said, we've had a 66% increase in house prices since the last review of negative gearing and capital gains tax. We've seen an incredible ramp up since 2021 in housing. There is clearly a two-tiered system with regards to whether you live in Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, to some
Mm.
extent Sydney. Melbourne is being left behind. It's now on a median level, the fifth most expensive city, which is fascinating considering it's the second largest density wise. Where does house price scenarios play out with the current levers that we have in 2026 and 2027? Because there is clearly no end in sight in the growth that is going on in housing, despite the fact that we're showing signs of slowing down at the end of last year.
Mm.
It's
Mm.
re-accelerated.
Yeah, so, it's a very patchworky kind of market
Mm.
at the moment, as you say. We're facing a challenge of higher interest rates in 2026, which is going to limit borrowing capacity, and it will have an impact on consumer sentiment, the amount of money that can be taken out to buy housing. For some markets like Sydney and Melbourne, which are historically very interest rate sensitive, this probably means a bit of a flatline or a decline. For markets that are driven by kind of different fundamentals, like in WA and Queensland, for example, you're still going very strong off the back of high population growth, high demand for commodities, and strong jobs growth. That continues to see very high rates of growth, but slowing. Historically, what you see in Australia's housing market, even butting up against things like the GFC, the uncertainty of COVID, rapidly rising interest rates that we saw in 2022, 2023, is that the downturns in our housing market are very small relative to the size and the time of upswings. And that is in part because we have such a secure lending system. We have very low levels of securitization. We have very conservative testing, stress testing, and buffers around who we give mortgages to. And what that means is that there's a lot of financial stability there. When the market starts softening, when prices start going down, homeowners are generally very well positioned to service their mortgages and they withhold supply. And of course, that kind of environment adds to developers withholding supply because it's not feasible for them to be building more housing, which, by the way, is where a competitive stream of public housing should be coming into play and helping to offset that cyclicality, that cyclical nature.
Hmm.
Um, and so prices just don't go down that much. Sales do, listings volumes do. Peak to trough declines in sales volumes amid those um, uncertain economic times average a decline of about 25%. But the biggest price decline we've ever seen in housing is, I think it was 7.5% around the GFC, or it may have been the response to rapid rises. But point is, it's never really been more than 8% nationally. So it's when you start to see rising interest rates and hear about a downturn, it's nothing really to get excited about from a first home buyer perspective. You're not going to see price declines that create an opportunity in the market. If anything, you get the double whammy of prices not falling that much and also your borrowing capacity becoming more limited.
Yeah, again, the research that I had done in the past around property with university was you highlighted it straight out, which is again, Australians' wealth is so tied to their land value and to their property that if they don't expect to get the value they want, they'll actually just take the supply out of the market. And that's what we pretty much see every time. And that's what you were alluding to is there again, it's what we've been to sort of running around this entire exchange, which is if there are changes to the market that are going to impact the wealth of the holder, so the supplier of the actual asset, it just reduces, and so they will wait until the actual going to get that price. And this is the conundrum that I'm sort of putting to you as well, because then the other thing we know about supply, and the next part of the discussion has got to be rent. Rent, from my world, coming to the economic side, is one of the biggest issues that the RBA's now got, which is housing is at 5.2% at the last figure. 4.6% of that 5.2% is around rents. The rest is around from the increases in new builds and new construction. That is the biggest concern in terms of the inflation story because it makes up over, 25% of the inflation basket.
Mm-hmm.
The rental story, I'm not asking you to, solve it in one question or answer, but how and what do we need to do to actually take pressure off rents, but also make sure that the yields that are on a, offer are actually attractive enough to bring more supply to market?
Well, that's where public housing supply comes in because
Yes.
public housing supply doesn't worry about rent yield and return. I think, in a way, we have kind of financialized affordable housing more by transferring it to community housing and all these different equity models and things like that. But at the end of the day, public housing, it should be treated like this kind of public infrastructure investment that actually delivers returns because when people don't have as much pressure in their, in paying their rents, then it can create cost savings, especially when it comes to, you know, um, urgent care, for example, for people who are experiencing housing instability, um, and getting into a situation where they need, additional medical attention because they haven't been able to have secure housing. It's like your preventative investment in social housing mitigates that cost down the line. So I think that's got to be a big part of the answer. Um, Obviously, like, again, going back to the 2010s, there was a massive supply glut because of all of this investment speculation in housing. And I grant you, it massively reduced or it kept rents very low. So throughout the entirety of the 2010s, your average annual growth in rents was only 2% a year. Now it's closer to 6% a year. And that oversupply of property and that big investment boom did help, but it didn't help things like home ownership because so much of the new stock being developed was being sold to investors. Investors at one point made up almost half of the market, and the home ownership rate actually went down between the 2011 and 2016 census. So, depending on the kind of housing outcomes you want, if home ownership is one of those, I don't think encouraging investment ownership of property is the answer to addressing rents at the
Yeah,
same time.
yeah, I think that's the other part of the answer here is that my next question for you is material, right? So I completely agree with that. Is that do we also have a bit of a problem here in Australia that the materials that we allow for housing restricts us too much? I mean, we don't do some of the housing like cross lamination that we see in Europe and in the UK, etc., as a housing material that we use here readily. We don't use concrete slurry as a form of
Mm,
building material like they do over there as well. Even using shipping containers has become a very, very boom thing in parts of continental Europe. Is that also where the regulation can improve productivity? I mean, the speed at which you can develop housing with the construction materials allowed would certainly move that dial, would it not?
Potentially, but the thing about construction material inputs is that they've gone up massively everywhere. Like
Uh,
that issue we have here of rising labor and material costs is quite a universal one that has come out of the COVID period. I think from just some of the research, again, the stuff that's been coming out of Grattan and some of that more supply side contingent, their argument is that the biggest lever you could pull is more around zoning and floor space ratio to increase the feasibility of high density projects. Now, I know what you're saying about potentially people don't want to live necessarily in high density projects. And you would probably know better on that than I in terms of the behavioral element. And if you look
mhm.
back on sales data, data from the ABS, it's like the overwhelming majority of owner occupiers and first home buyers purchase standalone homes.
Yep.
However, it's like, what if we just haven't built the product that they want in the apartment space because it lacks feasibility, because it's been more investor grade? I mean, who's to say if you don't build apartments that have high building quality, 3 bedrooms, good light and ventilation, that people wouldn't want to live in that?
Yeah, I completely understand that point. The caveat that comes back from the other side is that per square meter, the cost of building high density is so much higher. So the average per square meter cost for high density is getting towards $900 a square, whereas an off the plan 3, 4 townhouse scenario is more along the lines of 450 to 650. And again, this is where the pushback comes is that high density has higher levels of regulation that you have to meet, higher level of materials that you need to meet, higher levels of engineering that you need to meet, and therefore, even with all that, the pushback straight away is that no matter what you do, even if you go down the social housing side, is that per square meter it doesn't make sense. So the environment from a regulatory and an overall perspective has pushed us to where we are now. Changing it is a slow moving ship, and that's the catch with it is that changing the legislation not only takes months and years, it then also has to filter through.
Mm,
And I'm not expecting the answer.
mm.
My question that I keep asking is that in the interim, what would be 3 things that you think should be implemented to actually start rotating the ship.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the demand side is really important. Like, if we can't as easily and feasibly deliver new housing, then we need to look at how we distribute and occupy existing stock. And that does come back to curtailing things like a capital gains tax discount and negative gearing benefits to shift the composition of ownership from investment to owner occupation. Ideally, you would also have more efficient taxes around transaction and incentives to hold property, which is swapping out stamp duty for a broad based land tax at the state level. And I think something that we have seen kind of on the supply side is more state overreach of the kinds of projects that can be approved in local councils as well. Part of the problem with local government direction around what kind of developments can go up in an area comes from the fact that the people that would benefit from those new developments don't actually live in the area yet. So seeing housing supply more as that like statewide allocation, I think would be helpful as well.
It's been a cracking talk, and I wish we could talk for ages. I do have to finish up with the question I ask all of my guests, and I think you've already said it anyway through this entire exchange. But Eliza Owen, if you're in charge for just one day, what would you do?
If I were in charge for just one day, I would do what I could to shift housing as from an investment to something that you live in. And I think it is time that we pared back the capital gain tax concession and negative gearing benefits that go to investors, particularly investors with large property portfolios. Um, am I in federal? Do I
You can
have
be
to
wherever
go
you
quick
want to
then?
be. You can so this is like the reason it's such a broad question is that you can be in charge of just local council, you could just be in
Yeah,
charge of your local, employment. It's up to you in terms of how you would do this.
yeah.
Everyone has been different.
I think I would stick with that, and then I would also just start a massive, public housing build, like, Kevin Rudd in '08 or, what we had in the post-war period. Um, yeah, to boost supply, to take pressure off the rental market. That seems like the most obvious levers to me.
And I think that is an incredible place to finish. Eliza Owen, has been an absolute pleasure to have you on Exchanges. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. It's been great to chat.
Big thank you to Eliza and to you out there, as always, for watching Exchanges. We love bringing these to you. Thank you for joining us again for season 4. As I said, keep a lookout for what will happen with the Exchanges this year. We are going to change the things up a bit and bring you some more details, some more guests, and some different style of episodes. With that in mind, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button, whether you're watching, listening, etc. The more subscribers we get, the more and more growth we can bring around the Exchanges platform and the overall group that you are. We do have an email. It's exchanges@evanlucas.com.au. If you've got any ideas or any thoughts, questions, or things that you want me to talk about, please don't hesitate to bring that in. But as always, thank you for joining us at Exchanges. We'll talk to you again next week.